The Iran-Israel conflict has historically been one of the most complex and deep-rooted rivalries in the Middle East. Tensions between the two countries have been simmering for decades, fueled by ideological, political, and strategic differences. This conflict has primarily been marked by proxy battles, covert operations, and a war of influence across the region. However, over the past year, the dynamics have changed dramatically. The escalation, which began with the assassination of key figures such as Ismail Haniyeh and Hassan Nasrallah, has now developed into a potentially catastrophic confrontation with the real possibility of a full-scale war that could engulf the entire region. The turning point in this conflict was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, a senior Hamas leader, on July 31, 2024, in Tehran, Iran. Haniyeh was in Tehran to discuss the strengthening of Hamas-Iran relations and coordinate military support in Gaza. His assassination inside a high-security military guest house in the Iranian capital was widely attributed to Israel. This attack not only eliminated a high-ranking figure within Hamas, but also sent a strong message to Iran about Israel's reach and capability to target its allies even within its own borders. This act was perceived as a direct affront to Iranian sovereignty and a provocation aimed at disrupting Iran's influence in Gaza. The impact of Haniyeh's death was felt almost immediately. Iran, which had long viewed Hamas as a key component of its axis of resistance against Israel, was outraged. The IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, issued a statement condemning the assassination as a terrorist act and vowed that Israel would face severe consequences. Within days, Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq began launching coordinated missile and drone attacks on Israeli military positions in the Golan Heights and on U.S. bases in western Iraq. These attacks were intended to signal Iran's readiness to retaliate and to complicate Israel's security posture by creating multiple fronts. Israel responded with heavy airstrikes on Iranian and proxy positions in Syria, targeting key logistical hubs, command centers, and weapons depots. Israel executed a series of large-scale airstrikes, codenamed Operation Silent Thunder, targeting IRGC positions and supply convoys in Syria, as well as Iranian militia bases in Iraq. The operation aimed to disrupt Iran's logistical networks that supply advanced weaponry to Hezbollah and other proxies. By early August 2024, both sides were locked in a dangerous cycle of escalation, with each strike being met with a proportionate or greater response. The assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the long-standing Secretary General of Hezbollah, on September 27, 2024, marked the second major turning point in this year-long escalation. Nasrallah, who had been the leader of Hezbollah since 1992, was a key figure in the Iran-Israel conflict and one of the most influential leaders in the Shia axis. The strike was conducted with high precision, involving the use of multiple unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and real-time intelligence gathered by Israel's Mossad. The assassination, which took place in the southern suburbs of Beirut, shocked Hezbollah and Iran. Nasrallah's death left a vacuum in Hezbollah's leadership and significantly disrupted the group's military operations. The reaction from Hezbollah was immediate and severe. Within hours of Nasrallah's death, Hezbollah launched an unprecedented barrage of rockets and missiles into northern Israel, targeting cities such as Haifa and Safed, as well as strategic military installations. The sheer scale of the attack was unlike anything Israel had seen since the 2006 Lebanon War, involving over 2,500 rockets and missiles, many of which were precision-guided systems capable of hitting critical infrastructure. Israel's Iron Dome and David's Sling missile defense systems were overwhelmed by the volume of fire, with several projectiles managing to penetrate the defenses and cause significant damage to civilian and military areas. The Israeli response was swift and overwhelming. The IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, launched Operation Iron Viper, a comprehensive military campaign aimed at dismantling Hezbollah's military infrastructure in southern Lebanon. The campaign involved air and ground operations, with the Israeli Air Force targeting hundreds of Hezbollah's rocket launch sites, command centers, and logistical supply lines. Israeli ground forces moved to secure key border areas and engaged in intense combat with well-entrenched Hezbollah fighters in the mountainous terrain of southern Lebanon. The The fighting resulted in heavy casualties on both sides and led to a massive displacement of Lebanese civilians, raising concerns of a looming humanitarian crisis. With its proxies in Lebanon and Gaza under heavy pressure, Iran began to take a more active role in the conflict. By early October 2024, Tehran had deployed additional IRGC units to Syria and Iraq and began mobilizing its ballistic missile forces in preparation for a potential confrontation with Israel. Intelligence reports indicated that Iran was preparing to launch a new wave of missile attacks on Israeli military bases and critical infrastructure, raising the specter of a wider regional war. On October 3, 2024, Iranian state media announced that the IRGC had successfully test-fired a new generation of precision-guided ballistic missiles capable of reaching all parts of Israel. The announcement was seen as a direct warning to Israel, and within hours, Iran followed up with a salvo of missile strikes targeting Israeli positions in the Negev desert and military installations near Haifa. This attack, which involved Shahab-3 and Ghadr-110 missiles, was the largest direct Iranian strike on Israel to date and marked a significant escalation in the conflict. While Israel's missile defenses intercepted the majority of the incoming projectiles, several missiles managed to hit their targets, causing significant damage and triggering widespread alarm. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in a televised address, declared that Iran's actions constituted an act of war and vowed that Israel would respond with overwhelming force to ensure that such aggression is never repeated. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force launched a series of retaliatory strikes on key IRGC facilities in Iran, including missile production sites and command centers in the cities of Khorramabad and Isfahan. The strikes were highly precise, targeting key nodes in Iran's missile supply chain and causing substantial damage. However, they stopped short of targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, signaling that Israel was still seeking to avoid a full-scale war. Despite these efforts, the conflict continued to escalate. On October 5, 2024, the IRGC launched a new wave of ballistic missile and drone attacks, targeting Israeli military bases, strategic infrastructure, and even civilian areas. The missiles, which included some of Iran's most advanced systems, were launched from multiple locations across Iran, demonstrating Tehran's ability to conduct a coordinated strike across a wide geographic area. While Israeli defenses again intercepted many of the projectiles, several hit their targets, causing extensive damage and leading to casualties among Israeli military personnel. The potential for a broader conflict involving multiple state and non-state actors has now become a real and immediate threat. Hezbollah, which has vowed to avenge Nasrallah's death, is reportedly mobilizing its forces for a possible ground invasion of northern Israel. Such a move would almost certainly trigger a full-scale Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, with devastating consequences for civilians on both sides of the border. The Houthis in Yemen, another key Iranian proxy, have stepped up their attacks on Saudi and Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, raising the prospect of a maritime conflict that could disrupt global shipping and energy supplies. The involvement of other regional actors, such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey, has further complicated the situation. Each of these countries has its own strategic interests and alliances, and their involvement could turn the conflict into a multi-front regional war with no clear end in sight. The potential for a broader Sunni-Shia confrontation is high, as Sunni-majority states in the Gulf view Iran's growing influence as a direct threat to their security. Such a conflict would be devastating, not only for the immediate participants, but also for the broader Middle East, which would suffer from massive displacement, economic collapse, and the further entrenchment of militant groups. For the United States and other global powers, the stakes could not be higher. A prolonged conflict in the Middle East would undermine U.S. strategic interests, threaten key allies, and potentially force Washington to intervene militarily. The presence of U.S. forces in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf makes them vulnerable to Iranian and proxy attacks, and any direct Iranian strike on U.S. personnel could trigger a large-scale American response. The Biden administration has made it clear that it seeks to avoid another major military engagement in the region, but the scale of the current crisis may leave it with few options. The involvement of NATO and European allies would further complicate matters, as any perceived weakness in responding to Iranian aggression could embolden other adversaries in regions beyond the Middle East. Meanwhile, Russia and China, which have significant economic and strategic interests in the region, are also watching the situation closely. Russia, which has cultivated strong ties with both Iran and Israel, finds itself in a delicate position. While Moscow has called for restraint and offered to mediate, it is unclear whether Russia can play a meaningful role in de-escalating the conflict. China, with its significant economic investments in the region and reliance on stable energy supplies, has urged both sides to exercise restraint, warning that a prolonged conflict could destabilize the entire region and disrupt global supply chains. The economic implications of the ongoing conflict are already being felt around the world. Oil prices have surged to over $200 per barrel due to fears of disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, two of the world's most critical shipping choke points. The disruption of these maritime routes has led to increased shipping costs and delays, impacting global supply chains and exacerbating inflationary pressures in major economies. The stock markets in the United States, Europe, and Asia have reacted with significant volatility, and several major economies are bracing for potential recessions if the situation deteriorates further. The outlook for the current conflict is grim. With both Israel and Iran locked into a dangerous cycle of retaliation, the stakes for regional and global stability have never been higher. As the world watches the unfolding drama, the next moves by each nation will be critical in determining whether the Middle East can step back from the brink of a catastrophic war, or whether it is destined for a prolonged period of violence and chaos. The humanitarian consequences are severe and growing by the day. As of early October 2024, the conflict has already displaced tens of thousands of civilians in Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. Refugee camps in Lebanon are struggling to accommodate the influx of displaced persons, and humanitarian organizations are warning of severe shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. The risk of a broader regional conflict could lead to millions more being uprooted from their homes, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in the region's modern history. For Israel, the stakes are existential. The country has always viewed its military superiority and deterrence capabilities as critical to its survival in a hostile region. The prospect of a sustained missile barrage from Hezbollah, combined with attacks from Iranian proxies in Gaza, Iraq, and Syria, presents a severe threat to Israel's national security. While Israel's missile defense systems are among the most advanced in the world, they are not infallible, and a prolonged conflict would likely see its defenses overwhelmed. The possibility of mass casualties and extensive damage to critical infrastructure is a real and pressing concern for the Israeli government. Iran, for its part, is also operating under tremendous pressure. The death of Haniyeh and Nasrallah represents a severe setback for Iran's regional strategy. These leaders were not only valuable for their roles in coordinating military actions against Israel, but they were also symbols of Iran's influence over the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance movements. Iran's leaders face a difficult choice: escalate further and risk a full-scale war with Israel and potentially the United States, or back down and risk losing credibility among its proxies and allies. The decision will have far-reaching consequences for the region. One of the most significant risks of the current escalation is the potential for a miscalculation that could trigger a broader war. With so many actors involved, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iranian-backed militias, and the militaries of Israel and Iran, there is a high likelihood that a single incident could spark a chain reaction. For example, if Hezbollah were to launch a large-scale ground assault into northern Israel, it would almost certainly prompt an Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon. Such a move would trigger widespread devastation and could potentially draw in other regional powers, such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey, each with their own agendas and interests. The international community is struggling to respond to the crisis. The United States, which has long been Israel's primary ally, is in a difficult position. While Washington has condemned Iran's missile attacks and reaffirmed its commitment to Israel's security, it has also urged restraint, warning that a broader conflict could destabilize the entire region. The U.S. has increased its military presence in the Gulf and has been sharing intelligence with Israel. but it is unclear what role the U.S. would play if the conflict were to escalate further. A direct U.S. military intervention could potentially deter Iran, but it would also risk drawing the U.S. into another prolonged and costly conflict in the Middle East. Russia, which has significant interests in Syria and maintains close ties with both Iran and Israel, has called for an immediate ceasefire and offered to mediate between the two sides. However, Russia's leverage is limited, as its primary goal is to maintain stability in Syria and prevent the conflict from spilling over into its areas of influence. Moscow's ability to broker a lasting peace is further complicated by its strained relations with the West and its own military commitments elsewhere. China, which relies heavily on Middle Eastern oil and has significant economic investments in the region, is also deeply concerned about the potential for a prolonged conflict. Beijing has called for restraint and has suggested that the United Nations take a more active role in managing the crisis. However, China's influence in the region is primarily economic, and it lacks the military and political clout to enforce a ceasefire or broker a peace agreement. As a result, its role is likely to be limited to diplomatic efforts aimed at protecting its economic interests. The economic implications of a broader conflict are already being felt around the world. The surge in oil prices, driven by fears of disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, has exacerbated inflationary pressures in major economies. The global supply chains, already strained by geopolitical tensions and post-pandemic recovery challenges, are now facing further disruptions as shipping costs rise and insurance premiums for vessels transiting through the region skyrocket. If the conflict were to escalate further, it could trigger a full-blown energy crisis, with severe repercussions for the global economy. The impact on the global financial markets has been immediate. Stock markets in the United States, Europe, and Asia have experienced significant volatility, with investors reacting to the uncertainty and the potential for a protracted conflict. The volatility index, often referred to as the fear gauge, has spiked to its highest levels in years, indicating widespread concern among investors. Safe haven assets such as gold and U.S. Treasury bonds have surged in value, reflecting the growing unease in the financial markets. The potential for a broader regional war is also creating new security challenges for other U.S. allies in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Both countries are wary of Iran's growing influence and are concerned that a protracted conflict could lead to increased instability in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, in particular, has been the target of numerous Iranian-backed Houthi missile and drone attacks from Yemen, and there are fears that these attacks could escalate further if Iran decides to open new fronts in response to Israeli strikes. The Middle East is already home to some of the world's largest refugee populations, and a new wave of displacement could overwhelm the region's fragile social and economic infrastructure. Lebanon, which is already grappling with an economic crisis and political instability, would be particularly vulnerable. The influx of displaced persons would strain an already collapsing health and social services system, potentially leading to a complete breakdown of state functions. Syria, too, would be at risk of further destabilization. The conflict has already displaced millions of Syrians, and a new round of fighting could push even more people out of their homes. The potential for renewed fighting in southern Syria, where Iranian-backed militias and Israeli forces have clashed repeatedly, could create new waves of refugees, further complicating the situation. Iraq, which is home to a large number of Iranian-backed Shia militias, would also be drawn into the conflict. These militias, known collectively as the Popular Mobilization Units, PMUs, have already been involved in skirmishes with U.S. forces in the region, and a broader conflict could see them targeting American and Israeli assets. The potential for violence to spread to Iraq's southern oil fields, which are critical to the global energy supply, is a major concern for both regional and global stakeholders. Yemen, where the Iranian-backed Houthis have been fighting a Saudi-led coalition for nearly a decade, is another potential flashpoint. The Houthis have already launched several missile and drone attacks on Saudi and Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, and there are fears that they could escalate further if the conflict continues to spiral out of control. A new front in Yemen would not only exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in the country, but could also disrupt maritime traffic through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. a critical choke point for global trade. The international community faces a daunting challenge in trying to de-escalate the situation. The United Nations has called for an immediate ceasefire and has urged both sides to return to the negotiating table. However, with both Israel and Iran viewing the conflict as a zero-sum game, the prospects for a diplomatic resolution are slim. Iran sees any concession as a sign of weakness that could embolden its adversaries, while Israel views any compromise as a threat to its security. In conclusion, the Iran-Israel conflict has entered its most dangerous phase in decades. The deaths of Ismail Haniyeh and Hassan Nasrallah have transformed the conflict into an unpredictable and highly volatile confrontation that threatens not only the stability of the Middle East but also global security. The next steps taken by both sides will be critical in determining whether the region descends into a catastrophic war or whether there is still a path to de-escalation. The international community must act swiftly and decisively to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control, as the consequences of a full-scale war would be devastating for the region and the world.